Hi, this is Steph, and today we're looking at writing a winning HSC essay response for the HSC Standard English Examination Paper 2, Module A, Elective 2, Distinctly Visual. Module A will be question 2 in your exam paper because we have chosen Elective 2, Distinctly Visual, and we looked at the poetry of Douglas Stewart as our prescribed text. We then looked at the film Samson and Delilah and the memorial at the National Gallery as our two related texts. The 2014 HSC question for this section looked like this. You can see here there's some instructions. In your answer, you will be assessed on how well you demonstrate understanding of how the distinctly visual is created in texts, demonstrate understanding of the meaning shaped through distinctly visual, organize, develop and express your ideas using language appropriate to audience, purpose and form. So the question was, how do the qualities of distinctive images create interest and draw us into the experiences of others? It says, in your response, refer to your prescribed text and one other related text of your own choosing. And here you can see our prescribed texts, Douglas Stewart selected poems, and it actually lists the poems that we've studied in class: Lady Feeding Cats, Wombat, The Snow Gum, Nesting Time, The Moths, The Fireflies, Water Lily and Cave Painting. And we've deconstructed all of those poems in our class and annotated them all. So by the time we get to this practice question, you should have all the information that you need to flesh those out in an essay question. So let's have a closer look at the question. What qualities create distinctive images, and how do those qualities get us to become involved in the experiences or lives of others? Well, it's asking us here about imagery, the forms and features of language that affect interpretation and shape meaning. There's three key ideas with that, and that's how language, written, spoken and visual, creates images, how images shape and influence meaning, and the cultural and literary significance of images. What makes some images distinctive, memorable or influential? And what different types of textual forms and media use images? So in asking us what qualities create distinctive images and how those qualities get us to become involved, the question is asking us to look at literary techniques of language, form and structure. That's what this what and how is directing us towards. So we know that we're going to have to use all of those literary techniques that we looked at in class. The second part of the question asks us how we become involved in the experiences or lives of others. This is asking us about our perceptions and relationships with the text and the world. It's asking us how those visual qualities change our perceptions and interactions or relationships with other people, characters and the world. It's also looking at the very subjective way that we view texts. So how do we, as an audience, as readers, interact with the text based on the visual elements of that text? Which texts do we use? Obviously we have to use our prescribed text, which is the selected poetry of Douglas Stewart. We could use either of our related texts, Samson and Delilah, or the Aboriginal memorial at the National Gallery. Both of our related texts would fit really well with this question, and I'll create a mind map scaffold for both, and I'll let you decide which related text you'll write about when you complete your answer. So let's look at Douglas Stewart first. Firstly, I want you to note the prescribed poems. So in the question we saw a list of poems. It is in your best interest to refer to the poems on the list. That's why the list is there. Then we're going to look at what qualities create distinctly visual imagery. To do that, we'll discuss the main literary techniques used by Stewart. For example, we might look at imagery, personification, metaphor. It's a very long list, and you need to write down all of the elements and literary techniques that you want to discuss and find examples of those in the poetry. The next thing it asks us is, how do they draw us in? How do these literary techniques involve us in the text? So for example, in The Lady Feeding the Cats, we get involved in the life of that lady feeding the cats, and that's because of all the literary techniques that Douglas Stewart uses to draw us into that story. We become involved in the experiences of others. So in Douglas Stewart's poetry, we relate strongly to the visual perception of the world around Stewart. Think about the fireflies, for example. We are transported to the scene to watch the fireflies dance. And that is because Douglas Stewart uses lots of these literary techniques to draw us into and make us feel like we're a part of that world. It also affects how we relate to the lives of others. So when we read the poem of The Lady Feeding Cats, it calls up experiences from our own lives. So we're subjectively reading the texts. We're bringing our own personal experiences into what we're reading and engaging with the content in that context. So the cultural aspect at the end of The Lady Feeding Cats, where we see how her life is and how it was, invites us to relate to our own lives and our own experiences. Let's look at Samson and Delilah. This is a different kind of text because it's a film. So it's a very visual film, and it has qualities of distinctive images. The film has very little dialogue and tells its story in a visual format. The images created on the screen project enough information that the viewer is able to piece together the whole story. And in many ways, the story becomes even deeper and more layered because there is no dialogue in the film. This is done through cinematic techniques and qualities of distinctive images. Elements such as juxtaposition of events and objects. For example, the scene with Delilah sitting on the hill in the city when she's very dejected and the girls are sitting in front of her on their mobile phones contrasts Delilah's life at that age with the two white girls at the same age as her. That's a very powerful image with no dialogue, and it says a lot. It's a very distinctive image. There's also objects that represent whole stories. For example, Gran's wheelchair in the dirt, and the cutting of the hair for funeral or burial. And there's also the settings, the town versus the country. So we can see that Samson and Delilah's lives are very different when they're in the city or the town, as opposed to when they're back on country. How do these visual techniques draw us in? Well, it's all about perspective. The film is shown from both Samson and Delilah's perspective, but this is done without narration. It's done through visual positioning of the camera and the actor. And that's very clever positioning and something that's worth mentioning in terms of cinematic techniques. We become involved in the experiences in the lives of Samson and Delilah. So through all these cinematic techniques, we become directly involved in their lives and we can relate deeply to the struggles that they face. Let's have a look at the Aboriginal Memorial. It's a piece of visual installation art. The installation of 200 funeral poles tells many stories simultaneously through extensive layering of visual imagery. From the story of 200 years of occupation and frontier wars, to the story of the Northern Territory peoples, to the individual stories of each artist. The techniques used to do this, the strong use of symbolism and representation. The poles represent Aboriginal deaths in each year since invasion. The structure of the installation represents the river in Arnhem Land and each nation's place along that river. And each group of poles represents an Aboriginal nation. On top of that, each individual pole represents the individual person who has painted it. How does this draw us in? Well, the symbolism in the work invites us to learn what stories lie behind each part of the installation. They invite us to go deeper into the work and actually ask ourselves what those pictures are representing. We become involved in the experiences and lives of the artists. Through this artwork, we connect with the stories of Aboriginal peoples since invasion, and particularly with the stories of the Yolngu peoples from northeast Arnhem Land who have represented their nations and stories on the poles. So what's next? Now we've fleshed out what we're going to talk about in our mind maps, we need to turn that into an essay response to the practice question. And we'll do that in video 2 of this series. So I'll see you then. Thanks.